Last 2 months, we talk about career as well as finances. This month, I'm going to talk about how to build company for scale. When you're building company for scale, first you have to build the product, which is scalable. Then you have to have team with the scaling mindset. Then when you are dealing with customers, you need to make sure the scale and how you can continue to have reliability and quality for customers. And finally, how do you go into a mass production in a scalable fashion? So today's discussion is going to focus on how to build product for scale. This has to be thought from the beginning as a foundation. You don't want to think about building product later and think about how we are going to scale, because that may set you back so much. So I have 10 principles I'm going to talk about how you think about building a company in, say, building a product from the beginning for scale. First and foremost one is build from foundation. What does it mean by build from foundation? Is if you think about everything in science, you have foundational principle for physics, chemistry, bio, and every other field. So you need to make sure you have the right team members who have that good foundational knowledge which they can build on top of that. I remember when we talked to Elon Musk, he always goes back to the first principle and go to the foundation. So just make sure everyone think from foundation. The second one is similar to the first one, tear down to foundation. When you are in execution mode or you're going through something, you may encounter a roadblock or some issues. So you don't want to sit there and mingle what to do at that point. By going back to the foundation, tearing back the problem to the foundational accepted principles, you will be able to get back to the problem and solve that particular issue rather than focusing on everything. So you need to make sure you tear down problems back to the foundation. The third principle is less is more. I remember reading somewhere the code never written is the best code. Same thing in when you're designing hardware, a component which is never used is the best component, because having more code or more component, it add more complexity. When you're going to build for scale, you may run into issues. So you need to have the optimal way of solving problem with minimal number of lines or lines of codes or minimal number of components. So the next one is documentation. People tend to think startup, we do everything on the fly, we don't have to write down everything, we will know everything. No, for scalability, you need to make sure you document everything. You don't have to go overdo that, but you need to make sure concisely and precisely write down what you are doing, because when you run into some problem, you can go back and review those documentation and get back to the problem solution faster. So you need to make sure still you need to do some documentation, and everyone should be part of that. The next item, the item 5, is review and refine. So as you go through the project, you will learn something new, or the market might have changed, or the customer requirement might have changed. So you need to make sure continuously you review the progress, review the status, and then as you have the internal input as well as external input, you refine and rearrange. If you don't do that, what happens is you go for 12 months and you find out you made this mistake, and it is going to even extend the time. So make sure you continue to have these reviews, as well as whatever you learn from that, you refine and apply for future development. The next item is, from the beginning of development, you need to have scale in the mind. What does it mean? So at the beginning, when you're planning the project, normally there is a planning phase, there is a architecture phase, development phase, QA phase, and production, going to production phase. So you need to make sure you plan it from beginning to the end, and you have enough resources set up towards the end to do the reliability as well as quality check. Because when you scale the product, suddenly you may run into a lot of problem. So the last phase of the quality assurance, or another way people say is called RDT, reliability demonstration testing. When you run that, you may find the issues which could happen in the scale. So before you go and launch the product, you need to make sure you have enough resources in enough time to run that RDT testing. So from the beginning, you had to have that in your mind that reliability is important, and you have set apart some resource for that. The item 7 is systematic releases. When you are developing a product, there could be so many features requests comes through. So you need to make sure you systematically identify what is the most important feature and what is the minimal requirement. People call it MVP, or minimum, various minimum part. So you need to make sure you develop that minimum viable product from the beginning. Then on top of that, you can continue to add additional features. So this is similar to the agile process in software development, where you develop some portion and you drop it for QA, and the developers continue to develop, and as you go, you iterate over time. So when you go at the end, you would be able to go back and see where the mistakes were made. Same time, if the time is tight, you will have a minimum viable product to take it to the market while you continue to develop on the new features. So the next item is multi-sourcing components or multi-sourcing libraries. What does that mean is, because when you are developing some product, in the smaller scale, you may be able to get the component from one vendor easily. But when you suddenly go from 10,000 to 1 million, or the same thing, the code has to be gone through earlier version of the code to a newer version of the operating system, you need to make sure you have some backup. So for example, if there is some supplier have a problem, or on the other hand, supplier is raising the money, you need to be able to go and find another supplier who can fit into the same design without redesigning or requalification. So from a scaling point of view, it is important to think from the beginning how we can multi-source the code or the component for scale. The ninth item is quality over complexity. There are people who have done PhDs or who have done well done in their school. They want to solve the problem with the complex, very convoluted answers. But you want to have a product which has high quality at scale. So to get to that, you don't want too much complexity. You need to have product which has unique IP, unique solution. But that does not mean you need to go and develop a product very complex. So you need to focus on quality, which can be easily without much of complexity. You can go and scale to a bigger level. The final principle I try to follow is debuggability versus compaction. Some of the people try to write the code very compactual, with few lines of code very tightly and with so much logic into it. That is good practice most of the time, but you have to be careful, because when you need to debug a problem in the field, in the scale, you may run into problem. You don't know which variable had problem or which component has problem. So I say you want to be compaction or reduce the area or reduce the number of code, but you don't want to overdo that one. So you need to be able to give some debuggability, comments, as well as break the function into various modules. That way, when you run into a problem, you will be able to go and debug and identify easily. That is one of the foundational knowledge, in my opinion. That is why both of my companies which I worked with were successful, because we need to make sure we balance that we added debuggable functions, as well as reduce the complexity, compaction of the code, to make sure that we have enough hooks to go back and debug them. In today's article, I went through 10 steps how you can go and develop product for scale in mind from the beginning. That's a key word, from the beginning. So when you're planning, you want to make sure you have enough runway, enough money, enough resources allocated to the qualification at the end. And when you are designing, you always be able to go back to the foundational knowledge of it, and you continuously review and refine the product. That way you don't run into problem at the end and you had to redo the whole thing. And understanding, able to be debuggable and finding multi-component. So some of these things are, you will run into it. Just make sure you keep in mind, you continuously check on these item. By doing that, you will be able to build a scalable and quality reliable product. So please go ahead and try some of them. And I would like to hear from you also if you have some additional thing you do to make scalable product. Thank you. See you next week.